Working with decimals, we really want to be comfortable with rounding. That's going to be our primary use for decimals this term. And then in terms of math, we'll do kind of the same thing as with fractions, where we'll rely on the calculator to help us out. So in terms of place value, so we have our whole number places to the left-hand side of the decimals. So we see our ones, tens, hundreds, so on and so forth. Then to the right-hand side of our decimal, what we're getting are fractions. So we have tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, and 100,000ths. So those are getting this THS at the end of each of those wordings. So if I had something, so we can have number in each of these place values. We just want to make sure that we can round to them. So rounding to the tenths place would be leaving us with one decimal place. So let's say we're taking this 16.459 and we're going to round to the nearest tenth. So the place value we want to round is where the 4 is showing up, just to the right of the decimal place. And then to round it, what we want to do is look at the value to the right-hand side, which is a 5, which is telling us to round up. So we're going to keep the 16, we're going to keep that decimal, and then where I had a 4, that's going to now round up to a 5. And then we're just going to leave that as 16.5. Everything else disappears. So that 5.9, that 5 was just our rounding value, which told us to go up. So rounding to the nearest tenth will leave us with one decimal place. Rounding to the nearest hundredth will be to 2 decimal places. So 16.459. Now my rounding value, we're looking at rounding the 5, which means I need to inspect that 9, which is going to tell me to round up. So with that, we're going to have a 16.46. And then we just leave the 9 off. But with hundredths, we get 2 decimal places. So the terminology might change. They'll say round to the hundredths. They'll say round to 2 decimal places. They mean the same thing. Now for our class, this rounding to 2 decimal places is going to be really common. Even probably more common will be to 4 decimal places, which it will often just specify it that way, but it would technically be rounding to the 10,000ths place, so that we can see 4 decimal places trailing after our decimal. Okay, and then if we want to round to the nearest whole number, so 16.459, that means we would be rounding the 6. So it's that we would want to cut off at the decimal place. So I'd be inspecting that 4, which would tell us to round down. So this would round to a whole number of 16, and then we wouldn't see anything with the decimal. So we'll be doing lots and lots of rounding of decimals in our course, particularly to 2 decimal places or 4 decimal places, sometimes to whole numbers, but not as often. Okay, in terms of operations, so multiplication, addition, subtraction, all sorts of things, we're going to be relying on our calculator. And then with these, let's go ahead and practice rounding to the nearest hundredth, which is the same as 2 decimal places. So if we need to, sometimes we might not. So let me get my calculator. So we have a 0.374, and then that's multiplying with 0.2. So that's a 0.0748. And then we're going to round to the nearest hundredth. So I'm going to cut it off at 2 decimal places. And I'm just going to inspect that 4, which is telling us to round down. So I'm just going to round that to a 0.07. And that'll be my final answer. Okay, adding 16.92 with 7.56 is a 24.48 exactly. And if I was rounding to 2 decimal places, I don't need to do anything because it's already there. All right, this next one is a negative 38.69. and then adding that with 31.47, so a negative 7.22. That is already going to 2 decimal places, so we are all set there. And then this last one, 117.25 divided by 48 is big number 2.4427. But we're going to cut it off at 2 decimal places, and that means that 2 is telling me to round down, so I'm going to keep that at 2.44. And that's it for decimals. We'll get a lot more practice with this, but we just want to make sure we're rounding values correctly and accurately, since oftentimes we'll use those numbers for further calculations in our work.